After the United States became independent in the late 18th century, the country expanded rapidly. Through a combination of land purchases, wars of conquest, and border deals with Great Britain, by the late 19th century, the US stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific to the Arctic. From the 1890s, though, a new wave of American expansion began that resulted in a vast overseas empire. Expansionists in politics, the military, and business felt that the United States should join other imperial powers on the world stage, in their view, for prestige, to spread Christianity and civilization, and to further US business interests. Navy captain and strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan explained, "Whether they will or not, Americans must now begin to look outward. The growing production of the country requires it." The repeated recessions and economic uncertainty of the 1890s meant that some politicians feared unrest at home if they didn't expand markets and win distracting victories abroad. In 1895 and 1899, the US risked conflict with Britain and Germany over border and ocean navigation disputes in South America and the Pacific. US foreign policy supported the interests of powerful companies like United Fruit in Central America and John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Our ambassadors and ministers and consuls have aided to push our way into new markets and to the utmost corners of the world. American missionaries also spread US presence and influence, especially in China. But it was closer to home, in the Caribbean, where America's first overseas war of empire would begin. Throughout the 19th century, the United States became interested in increasing its influence over the nearby island of Cuba. Spain had ruled the island for centuries, but by the 1800s, Spain was a power in decline. In the 1810s, most former Spanish colonies in the Americas gained independence, but not Cuba, and Washington worried that another European power might sweep in and seize the territories. So President James Monroe introduced what later became known as the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. The US pledged to protect the political status quo in the Americas. American businessmen looked to Cuba's economic potential as well, especially southern cotton and sugar plantation owners. In the following decades, Cubans rose up in several revolutions against Spanish rule, often under the slogan of Cuba Libre, Free Cuba. Spain sent tens of thousands of troops to suppress them. As US interest in Cuba increased, so did tensions with Spain. The US offered to buy the island on several occasions, and newspapers and school textbooks portrayed Spain as backward and cruel. In 1873, war was barely avoided after Spanish authorities executed 58 sailors, including US citizens, for alleged gun running in support of the Cuban revolutionaries. In 1895, Cubans again rose up against Spanish rule, this time under leaders José Martí, Maximo Gómez, and Antonio Maceo, who had founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party from the US a few years earlier. They and many islanders were unhappy with Spanish corruption, economic decline, partially caused by US tariffs on sugar, and the suspension of civil liberties. The rebels used scorched earth and guerrilla tactics, ambushing Spanish troops and putting plantations to the torch to force the Spanish to leave. The strategy seemed to be working, as Spanish Captain General Martínez Campos admitted. "I have failed, but no force can crush this rebellion. There is a spirit at work here which defies the bayonet. I predict that soon this island will be lost to us forever." In response, the Spanish sent General Valeriano Weyler, whose repressive tactics earned him the nickname the Butcher. Through his policy of reconcentration, 100,000 Cubans would die in filthy and disease-ridden camps. The US tabloid media, the so-called Yellow Press, covered the atrocities, both real and imagined, in grisly detail. New York Journal owner William Randolph Hearst responded to criticism that his paper exaggerated Spanish actions. It would be difficult to exaggerate conditions in Cuba. We merely took a little dramatic license. Our editors were only serving the interests of the public. Americans hate Spain, so we gave them something to stew about. So Cuba was racked by revolution and Spanish repression, while the United States looked on. Many Americans demanded action, but Washington was hesitant. When President William McKinley was elected in 1897, he favored a diplomatic solution. The same year McKinley became president, a more liberal Spanish government came to power in Madrid. They recalled General Weyler and promised reforms in Cuba to calm critics in Spain and in the US. Cayetano Baliña, a blacksmith from San Adriano, reported on scenes that he witnessed in Spain that showed the impact of the war. Yesterday I was in Bijo to buy some necessary stuff and saw a horrible scene at the port. It was covered in coffins that were being unloaded from the ships. How many people will have to die before this damn war that is harming the nation so much will end? At this point, though, the Cuban revolutionaries were no longer responsive to vague Spanish promises of reform, and they demanded full independence. The crisis rapidly came to a head in 1898. In early February, Hearst's newspapers released a leaked memo from the Spanish ambassador to the US, which was starkly critical of President McKinley. McKinley is a weak bidder for the admiration of the crowd, a would-be politician who tries to leave the door open behind himself while keeping on good terms with the jingos of his party. But even more incendiary was the sinking of a US ship, the Maine, in the port of Havana. Some Americans suspected the ship was sunk by the Spanish, but in reality, it probably sank because of an internal explosion. In any case, the combination of 269 US lives lost on the Maine and the diplomatic insult piled pressure on McKinley. He resisted calls for war, but business owners, media pundits, and other politicians demanded action. Assistant Secretary of the Navy and future President Theodore Roosevelt did not hold back in his criticism of McKinley. McKinley has the backbone of a chocolate eclair. The president was facing a potential rebellion within his own Republican Party, so he gave in to the pressure on April 11th. He asked Congress for authorization to intervene and sent Spain an ultimatum demanding that troops evacuate Cuba and give up Spanish sovereignty over the island. The Spanish accepted some points of the ultimatum, but they refused on the issue of Cuban independence. On April 21, 1898, the US started a blockade of Cuba, so the Spanish declared war on the United States April 23rd. The US also declared war 2 days later. What Senator John Hay would describe as a, quote, splendid little war had begun. So the Cuban crisis led to the start of the Spanish-American War in April 1898. America was at war, but its goals were not yet entirely clear, and the US military was not entirely prepared. American leaders argued about what they wanted to achieve from the war against Spain. Expansionists suggested the US annex Spanish possessions, but anti-imperialists opposed this idea. Eventually, Senator Henry Teller demanded an amendment denying any US intention to annex Cuba. This move angered expansionists, but Congress approved it with little opposition. Regardless of US war aims and high public expectations, the actual military situation was less promising for the Americans. In April 1898, the US Army had just 28,000 men, and the larger state militias were poorly trained and not suitable for overseas duty. As a result, the government announced a huge military spending increase and a call for volunteers. The War Department wanted 125,000 new troops, but by August, 290,000 had signed up. One of the most famous volunteers was Teddy Roosevelt himself. He resigned his Navy position to join the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, known as the Rough Riders. U.S. Officer John H. Parker described the unusual nature of the unit. The Rough Riders were the most unique aggregation of fighting men ever gathered together in any army. There were cowboys, bankers, brokers, merchants, city clubmen, and society dudes, commanded by a doctor, second in command a literary politician, but every man determined to get into the fight. The flood of US volunteers also created problems. Training camps became overcrowded, spreading diseases like typhus and scarlet fever. Equipping all the men was also an issue. Although federal troops had adopted the modern Norwegian-designed bolt-action Krag-Jørgensen rifle, many US soldiers were still equipped with the obsolete M1873 trapdoor Springfield, which fired black powder cartridges. There was also a lack of tropical equipment, so some soldiers wore woolen winter uniforms. Meanwhile, the Spanish had 130 to 160,000 men, although there was a great divergence in morale and in training. But the Spaniards were armed with the excellent M1893 Mauser rifle and smokeless ammunition, and had far more experience in Cuban conditions. Armies take time to train and mobilize, and so immediate attention turned to the navies. With the US Navy blockading the island, Spanish Admiral Pascual Cervera y Topete sailed for Cuba from Cadiz. Despite the strong Spanish naval tradition, Admiral Cervera was not optimistic about his chances. The US Navy had rapidly expanded and modernized in recent years, with steel-plated cruisers and battleships faster and better armed than anything that the Spanish had. Do we owe to our country not only our life, if necessary, but the exploitation of our beliefs? I am very uneasy about this. I ask myself if it is right to make myself an accomplice in an adventure which will surely cause the total ruin of Spain. And for what purpose? To defend an island which was ours but belongs to us no more? To lose all our wealth and an enormous number of young men in the defense of what is now no more than a romantic idea. The Spanish and US navies were on a collision course in the Caribbean, but the first shots of the war at sea would end up being fired 16,000 kilometers away near a different Spanish possession in a different ocean. The Philippine Islands had been a Spanish colony since the 1570s and also saw a series of uprisings in the 19th century, as well as the growth of a short-lived peaceful independent movement known as La Liga Filipina. Unlike Cuba, however, before the war the islands received little US attention, as President McKinley admitted to a reporter. I can't tell you within 500 miles where the Philippine Islands are located, and what's more, I don't care. They are of no concern to the United States. However, Manila, with its large natural harbor, was home to the Spanish Asiatic Fleet, a potential threat to US interests, according to Washington. Even before the declaration of war, Commodore George Dewey's US Asiatic Fleet was ordered to prepare for operations and contact potential allies among the Filipinos. In 1896, a revolt of largely Tagalog-speaking Filipinos broke out in Luzon under the command of Emilio Aguinaldo. After a bloody guerrilla campaign, the Spanish cut a deal with the rebel leader. In exchange for $850,000, over $30 million in today's money, and promises of reform, Aguinaldo went into exile. But by 1898, only half the money had been paid, no reforms had been implemented, and so he continued to agitate rebels in the Philippines from abroad. Dewey now contacted Aguinaldo and asked him to help a US invasion. Aguinaldo accepted, but the terms of their agreement would cause long-term issues. Aguinaldo claimed that Dewey and Colonel Wood promised him a Filipino republic after victory. The Americans later said they made no such promise, and historians are still divided on the issue. Regardless, by late April 1898, Aguinaldo was contacting his fighters for a renewed attack, while Dewey moved against the Spanish fleet in Manila. Like his Atlantic counterpart, the Spanish commander, Admiral Patricio Montojo, was pessimistic. His fleet was decrepit, with just 2 protected cruisers, 5 unprotected cruisers, and 5 gunboats. Although he had the protection of coastal guns and the harbor, his mines were defective and the US guns outranged his. Montojo expected defeat, so he planned to fight in shallow water, as he explained to a colleague. When the Americanos sink our ships, the masts will protrude out of the water. Our sailors can climb to the top and wait in safety until rescued. Otherwise, everyone might drown. In the early hours of May 1st, Dewey's 4 protected cruisers and 2 gunboats slipped into Manila Harbor, where they engaged the Spanish at 5:40 a.m. The Spanish ships opened fire with an ineffective broadside, after which the US ships returned fire. The Americans attacked the Spanish fleet 5 times, and the Spanish flagship Reina Cristina even tried to charge the US vessels, but was racked by American fire. By mid-morning, the one-sided battle was over. Some Spanish ships ran themselves ashore, and overall, 381 Spaniards were killed or wounded. US casualties are not entirely clear, but were very low. Some claim only 1 American sailor died, and that from a heart attack. Dewey's victory was the first of the war for the US and made him into a national hero, but he couldn't occupy Manila. Privately, many US officers were disappointed with their performance. Of the roughly 6,000 shells that they'd fired, only 145 hit their targets. By mid-May, the US was building up an invasion force in San Francisco, but the other powers were quicker. Before the US fleet arrived, British, French, German, and Japanese ships arrived to observe the situation and potentially take advantage of any Spanish loss of control. So with the Spanish Asiatic fleet defeated and Manila surrounded, attention shifted back to Cuba. By May 19th, Admiral Cervera slipped past the US fleet and entered Santiago de Cuba Bay. But then a US fleet under Rear Admiral William T. Sampson trapped the Spanish in the bay, which cleared the way for American amphibious landings. With the bulk of Spanish forces around Havana, the US strategy would focus on an invasion of the southeast coast between Daiquiri and Siboney. American troops could then join with Cuban rebels and threaten the fleet in Santiago. General William Shafter was in command of the US invasion force, but at 140 kilograms and suffering from gout, he was not an ideal choice for the tropical climate. He did, however, have experience in the US Civil War and in the wars against Native Americans. In early June, US Marines established a coaling station at Guantanamo Bay before the main US invasion force arrived on June 22nd. Their landings were uncontested, with the only casualties resulting from accidents. Instead, the US troops were received by Cuban rebel commander Calixto Garcia. Despite initial friendly greetings, relations quickly soured. The Cubans were in a more difficult state than the Americans expected them to be, based on US media illustrations. Many officers, including Roosevelt, were extremely critical. The Cuban insurgents were a crew of as utter tatterdemalions as human eyes ever looked on, armed with every kind of rifle in all stages of dilapidation. It was evident at a glance that they would be of no use in serious fighting, but it was hoped that they might be of service in scouting. From a variety of causes, however, they turned out to be nearly useless even for that. The Americans also thought that the Cubans were cowards, since the rebels were reluctant to face the Spaniards in open battle. Garcia protested against these charges in a letter to Shafter. "We are a poor, ragged army, as ragged and poor as was the army of your forefathers in their noble war for independence. But like the heroes of Saratoga and Yorktown, we respect our cause too deeply to disgrace it with barbarism and cowardice." These American attitudes towards the Cuban fighters are not fully justified. The rebels were mostly an irregular guerrilla force skilled at ambushes rather than assaults against entrenched Spanish troops. Despite Cuban misgivings, Shafter ordered his troops toward the village of Las Guasimas on June 24th. The Americans advanced in two columns, regular troops on the road and the Rough Riders, mostly as dismounted cavalry, moving through the jungle. Soon they ran into Spanish troops and a firefight ensued. Although the Spaniards' smokeless powder gave them an edge in the fighting, after a 2-hour battle the Spaniards made a planned withdrawal. As they did so, American officer Joe Wheeler, who was a former Confederate general, reportedly shouted that he had, quote, "the damn Yankees on the run." The Americans had defeated the Spanish in the first Cuban combat, but their commanders were divided. Admiral Sampson wanted Shafter to clear the coastal batteries around Santiago for the Navy, but instead, Shafter decided to attack the city himself. For Shafter, speed was the key to taking Santiago, since disease had already begun to spread among the US troops. Blocking the way to the city, however, were Spanish positions on the San Juan Heights. The Spanish had fortified the village of El Caney and had prepared trenches, blockhouses, and artillery on Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill. The US plan was for about 5,400 troops under Brigadier General Henry Lawton to attack El Caney and force out the defenders in just 2 hours. Meanwhile, the remainder of the force would attack the heights and pin down any Spanish reinforcements on their way to El Caney. Once through, Lawton planned to pursue the retreating Spaniards all the way to Santiago. On July 1st, Lawton began the main attack at around 6:30 a.m., but immediately it became clear that he'd underestimated the Spanish defenders. Despite being outnumbered 10-1, the Spaniards held off US troops for 8 hours. With no breakthrough imminent, more US troops moved in, including the Rough Riders, but artillery support was minimal. Most of the US guns were obsolete, and Spanish shrapnel had already suppressed several gun crews and shot down an American observation balloon. The US did have an experimental dynamite gun which used compressed air to fire explosives, but it was stuck in a nearby gorge. Spanish sharpshooters and fire from the trenches bogged down the advancing US troops. As casualties mounted, the Americans tried another novel weapon to break the deadlock: Gatling guns on lightweight wheeled mounts. US officers sent these 10-barreled, hand-cranked automatic weapons up to the front to suppress the Spanish trenches. The covering fire of the Gatling guns allowed US infantry to get within assaulting range of the Spanish positions, and the sound of the rapid fire also raised US morale. US Lieutenant John Gatling Gun Parker commanded the Gatling detachment and later wrote florid praise for the weapon. At this time, the Gatling gun began to talk. It spoke very voluble and eloquent orations which, although not delivered in the Spanish language, were well understood by our friends, the enemy, upon the hill. At around 1 p.m., American forces stormed the hills. The Rough Riders, along with the African-American Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, attacked Kettle Hill, while the 1st Division took on San Juan Hill. They broke through the barbed wire, entered the Spanish trenches, and cleared them in close quarters fighting. First Kettle Hill fell, then San Juan, which made the Spanish position in El Caney impossible to hold. The Spanish counterattacked in the afternoon, but the intense US rifle and Gatling fire stopped them. The surviving Spanish forces retreated to Santiago. The storming of the San Juan Heights also cemented Roosevelt's reputation as a daring war hero, and the order to storm the hills is often attributed to him. However, although Roosevelt took part in the assault, the actual order came from Lieutenant Colonel John Miley. The US capture of the San Juan positions marked the end of significant fighting in Cuba. On July 3rd, Admiral Cervera, fearing assault from both land and sea, attempted to escape the harbor, but the superior US Navy destroyed his fleet. Spanish Lieutenant Joaquim Bustamante recalled the effect of the American guns. One shell cut the boatswain in half, and part of his body fell into the steering control line. And as a result, we lost partial rudder control and had to clear the body from the steering control line. Next, a shell destroyed the steam governor. A third exploded on the poop deck magazine and destroyed it. On the 17th, Santiago surrendered after a short siege, although the Americans banned the Cuban rebels from attending the surrender ceremony at Spanish request. The war in Cuba was over. It cost 385 American and 800 Spanish lives in combat, and about 5,000 Americans would eventually die from disease. The US also targeted Spanish-ruled Puerto Rico. The island could be used as a strategic base in the Caribbean, including to protect the Panama Canal. In the years leading up to the war, the US government and business interests had pressured the Spanish to allow Puerto Rico more autonomy, with the goal of increasing US influence there. Puerto Ricans were divided between those who wanted autonomy but under Spanish rule, outright independence, or annexation by the US. Many anticipated a US invasion even before the war began, like exiled independence supporter Ramon Emeterio Betances. It's extremely important that when the first troops of the United States reach shore, they should be received by Puerto Rican troops waving the banner of independence and greeting them. Let the Americans cooperate in the achievement of our freedom, but not push the country toward annexation. If Puerto Rico does not move quickly, it will be an American colony forever. The US Navy had blockaded the capital of San Juan since May, even beating off a Spanish naval attack in June. Now, on July 25, 1898, US troops landed at Guanica with little Spanish resistance. Several small skirmishes took place, including at Coamo, Fajardo, San Germán, and Ay Bonito. Though the Spanish and Puerto Ricans delayed the American advance and even pushed them back out of a few towns, US forces maintained their advance until the ceasefire on August 13th. Military hostilities lasted just 19 days, and fighting was so light that only 3 American and 17 Spanish soldiers were killed before US forces took complete control of the island. Some Puerto Ricans welcomed the Americans with parades and fireworks, while others, especially peasants, took the opportunity to loot or burn plantations and even murdered some plantation owners they saw as oppressive. Major General Nelson A. Miles appealed to the population. "We have not come to make war upon the people of a country that for centuries has been oppressed, but, on the contrary, to bring you protection, not only to yourselves but to your property, to promote your prosperity, and bestow upon you the immunities and blessings of the liberal institutions of our government." With Cuba and Puerto Rico secured for the United States, American attention now shifted back to the Philippines. In late June, US troops captured the Spanish-held island of Guam before landing 10,000 men at Cavite in the Philippines on July 1st. The Spanish had tried to mobilize local civilians to support their cause, but Aguinaldo's Filipino rebels had far more support and the loyalty of many Filipino soldiers who were supposed to be serving Spain. In fact, at this point, the rebels had already surrounded Manila, but their relationship with the Americans was cool. Some US businessmen and politicians were calling for the annexation of the Philippines, which worried the Filipinos. A concerned Aguinaldo ignored US advice and announced Filipino independence on June 18th. He also wrote to the US Consul General. "I have read in the New York Evening Journal that I am getting a big head and not behaving as I promised you. In reply, I ask, why should America expect me to outline my policy, present and future, and fight blindly for her interests when America will not be frank with me? Tell me this, am I fighting for annexation, protection, or independence? It is for America to say, not me." With relations worsening, US General Wesley Merritt moved ahead without support from Aguinaldo's insurgents. By August 6th, he was discussing surrender with the Spanish Governor General Fermín Gaudénez y Álvarez. Gaudénez wanted to surrender to the Americans, but was concerned about punishment for not contesting the city. In the end, he requested a quasi-staged battle to give a pretense of resistance. Merritt agreed, and on August 13th, US guns bombarded an unmanned Spanish fort. Even so, in some places the fight was indeed real, and 6 US troops and an unverified number of Spaniards were killed. US volunteer soldier George Telfer wrote about the charade. "We call it a comic opera war. There was really no need of killing anybody. The Spanish Army Code makes death the penalty for an officer who surrenders his post without a fight. So you see, there had to be a fight, but it was not where it was likely to damage property." In reality, even this staged battle was unnecessary. Unbeknownst to both sides in Manila, Spain and America had already signed a ceasefire in Washington. In the final peace treaty signed in December, Spain ceded Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States. Cuba became independent, although a US military administration would oversee the island for the time being. The US also bought the Philippines from Spain for $20 million, over $700 million today. And Spanish administrators would temporarily stay in place. McKinley claimed that US control would bring infrastructure and peace to the islands, although commercial interests, concerns of other nations seizing the Philippines, and McKinley's religious convictions more likely drove the decision. So the United States had defeated Spain and acquired new territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific, but many Filipinos were not interested in American rule. The peace deal, which excluded the Cubans and Filipinos, was the last straw for Filipino rebel Aguinaldo. On January 23, 1899, Aguinaldo approved the constitution for an independent Philippine Republic, and Filipino forces around Manila rose up against the Americans on February 4th. Aguinaldo was clear as to his reasons. "It is my unavoidable duty to maintain the integrity of the national honor and that of the army so unjustly attacked by those who, posing as our friends and liberators, attempted to dominate us in place of the Spaniards." The revolutionaries were no match for US forces, but they retreated into the mountains and began to wage a guerrilla war. By summer, 35,000 US troops were attempting to suppress the so-called Philippines insurrection. By June 1901, Filipino fighters had launched 1,000 attacks against US forces. US soldier George Telfer described the nature of the jungle fighting. The enemy opened up on us. We would lay down and fire, then get up and advance. As we advanced, the enemy would retire and it became a foot race. The native can run faster than we can, and we could not get within 1,000 yards of him. We halted every half hour and rested. We burned every house we passed. This kind of US repression became commonplace. General Jacob Smith ordered his troops to turn Luzon into a, quote, howling wilderness by moving civilians into concentration camps. American troops arrested military-age Filipino men, some of whom they summarily executed. In March 1901, US forces captured Aguinaldo himself. His movement had been defeated and his own reputation damaged because he executed rival revolutionary leaders. He took an oath of allegiance to the United States and disbanded the Philippine Republic. Republican Filipinos, though, continued to resist US rule into 1902, while a separate rebellion of Muslim Filipinos continued even longer. The Philippine conflict claimed the lives of 5,000 US troops, 20,000 Filipino revolutionaries, and 250,000 Filipino civilians, many from disease and starvation. The Spanish-American War was short and one-sided, but it had important consequences. For Cubans, it meant a fragile independence weakened by decades of US military interventions. For the Philippines, it meant nearly 50 years of American rule. The war also saw the end of the remnants of Spain's once global empire. They even sold their remaining Pacific Island possessions to Germany in 1899. Some Spanish intellectuals of the so-called Generation of '98 promoted liberal reforms for the country after the war, while many military officers turned to more conservative views as a result of the defeat. The United States came out of the war much more confident on the world stage, and it felt free to intervene in the Americas whenever it saw fit. Some even felt that the war brought the country closer together after the Civil War and racial strife of the previous decades, although these divisions persisted. America also had a new overseas empire, one that companies like Bethlehem Steel and the United Fruit Company would prove eager to profit from under the protection of the US military. In the eyes of some, America had come of age. For others, it was the beginning of the American Age of Empire. The Philippines would play a crucial role in the Pacific War 40 years later. In 1941, the Japanese invaded and defeated the US forces there, and in 1944, US troops under Douglas MacArthur landed to liberate the Philippines again. During their campaign, they launched multiple daring raids to free prisoners of war. If you want to learn more about the raid of the Cabanatuan prison camp in early 1945, check out our new series, History's Most Daring Raids. And where can you watch History's Most Daring Raids? On Nebula, a streaming service we're building with other creators where you don't need to sift through a deluge of AI slop. Nebula is made and curated by humans, and it's available in 4K resolution on your browser, on your smartphone, smart TV, or streaming box like Apple TV or Roku. And that's not all. On Nebula, you can also watch all our regular videos ad-free and earlier than on YouTube. And all that for just $30 for an entire year if you go to nebula.tv/thegreatwar. Nebula is also a great gift, by the way. Just go to gift.nebula.tv/thegreatwar to give an entire year to family and friends, even if they already have an account. Victory in the Spanish-American War made America a global empire, and it whetted the appetites of expansionists looking for new conquests in the Pacific. By the late 19th century, the United States and the independent island kingdom of Hawaii had intense economic and diplomatic ties for decades. The US considered Hawaii to be in its sphere of interest, and stated as early as the 1840s it would tolerate no other foreign power interfering there. Most native Hawaiians wanted their kingdom to remain independent, but American and European communities on the islands, especially the influential business leaders, had other plans. Foreigners were only 10% of the population, but dominated Hawaii's important sugar production. and their influence grew while that of Hawaii's government weakened, partly because the native population declined due to disease. Many of these businessmen and other foreigners on the islands favored annexation by the United States, which already enjoyed preferential trade agreements and tariffs. In 1887, the Honolulu Rifles, a paramilitary force made up of foreigners and led by Lorne Thurston, forced the government of King Kalakaua to accept the so-called Bayonet Constitution, which increased the foreigners' control of the parliament and courts with a view to eventual annexation. The king also agreed to lease Pearl Harbor to the US Navy. Natives, like lawyer Joseph Poipoi, are outraged. The Americans have no respect for royalty, for they have no king. Therefore, they want to exercise the same power here as they do in their own country. They are doing it little by little, and it will not be long before Hawaii becomes an entire republic. We who cherish our king ought not to allow this to be done. In 1891, the king died and was succeeded by his sister, Queen Liliuokalani. She was a Christian convert and married to a white American, but opposed foreign control. The native population petitioned her to reverse the Bayonet Constitution, which she tried to do, but the foreigners saw her as a threat. In 1893, a small group of powerful American and European businessmen, calling themselves the Committee for Safety, launched a bloodless coup with the help of US Minister to Hawaii, John L. Stevens. Part of their motivation is to ensure annexation by the United States to avoid the sugar tariff Washington had imposed, which damaged Hawaiian sugar exports. They occupied the government building under the guns of the American warship USS Boston and US Marines, who officially entered Honolulu to, quote, protect US lives and property. The insurgents then named themselves the Provisional Government, and in 1894 declared a Hawaiian Republic under Sanford Dole, a Hawaiian-born American. Native Hawaiians opposed the coup and the Republic and rebelled under Robert Wilcox in a failed three-day revolution in 1895, leading to the imprisonment of the Queen and rebel leaders. In 1897, President McKinley and the Republic of Hawaii signed a treaty agreeing to annexation. The native population opposed the move and successfully petitioned the US Senate in Washington, and the treaty was defeated. In 1898, though, the outbreak of the Spanish-American War brought more public support for territorial expansion, and pro-annexation forces in Congress now argued that Hawaii would be an important military base in the Pacific for the war against Spain. On July 7, 1898, the United States and the Republic of Hawaii officially agreed to US annexation of Hawaii by joint resolution. President McKinley saw it as a fulfillment of destiny. The incorporation of the Hawaiian Islands into the body politic of the United States is the necessary and fitting sequel to the chain of events which from a very early period of our history has controlled the intercourse and prescribed the association of the United States and the Hawaiian Islands. Not only is the union of the Hawaiian territory to the United States no new scheme, but it is the inevitable consequence of the relation steadfastly maintained with that mid-Pacific domain for 3/4 of a century. Annexation was enacted in August 1898, with Hawaii receiving official territorial status in 1900 and eventually statehood in 1959. So the Spanish-American War and the annexation of Hawaii established the United States as a global player. This brought strategic and economic advantages, and although some US politicians and citizens opposed expansion, many Americans were enthusiastic. The taste of empire is in the mouth of the people. An imperial policy, the republic renascent, taking her place with the armed nations. The US military soon put its new Asian military bases to use, as American troops joined European and Russian forces in an intervention in China against the Boxer Rebellion to protect foreign commercial interests and influence in the country. Washington's open-door policy in China now gave US companies preferential access to the Chinese market. In 1907, Roosevelt decided to show the world, and especially an expansionist Japan, the US Navy's growing might. So he sent a fleet of 16 battleships and 14,000 sailors on a round-the-world cruise, known as the Great White Fleet. The operation was a PR success, although the Americans did struggle to supply the fleet given their lack of coaling stations abroad. A few of the ships even made an unplanned stopover in Sicily to provide humanitarian aid following an earthquake. The global cruise ended in February 1909, having lasted 14 months. The United States continued to expand its influence closer to home as well. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 declared that the US would oppose any new conquests by foreign powers in its sphere of interest, the Americas. But a crisis in Venezuela led to a dramatic change to the doctrine that would upend parts of Latin America for decades. In 1902, Venezuela was just coming out of decades of civil wars and revolts, which had caused its various governments to go deep into debt. The creditors were American and European, who also demanded payment for their citizens' property damage. Venezuelan President Castro at first refused, so the navies of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany blockaded the country for 3 months. The US did not participate, but also didn't intervene, and Washington was upset when an international arbitration court decision benefited the blockading countries and not the US. So President Theodore Roosevelt decided to redefine the Monroe Doctrine by adding the Roosevelt Corollary, which he explained in a message to Congress in 1904. Chronic wrongdoing, or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society, may in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. And in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Roosevelt had given the US a much lower threshold to intervene in the Caribbean and Latin America, though simply buying territory was still an option, one that Washington tried to use to acquire Greenland. As early as 1868, the United States had offered to buy Greenland from Denmark, which had colonized the island's southern coasts from the early 18th century. The deal fell through, but from the 1880s to 1909, American explorer Robert Peary traveled to remote northern Greenland and claimed parts of it for the United States, although these claims had no international legal status. In 1910, the US offered to buy the island again, and again the deal failed. During the First World War, the US also became concerned about a possible future German presence in the Caribbean. To protect the Panama Canal, Washington again approached Denmark. Back in 1902, the US had offered to buy the Danish West Indian Islands, a small archipelago in the Caribbean. Critical from the American point of view was that there was a deep water port that could be used for warships. In 1916, Denmark was ready to sell, so US and Danish diplomats agreed to a sale for $25 million, and the islands became the US Virgin Islands from 1917. The Danes, however, insisted on an addendum to the treaty, an extra agreement related to Greenland. Copenhagen requested that the US recognize its claim to all of Greenland. In an attached declaration, US Secretary of State Robert Lansing accepted on behalf of the US government. The government of the United States of America will not object to the Danish government extending their political and economic interests to the whole of Greenland. It was a deliberate exception to the US Monroe Doctrine of not allowing any new claims by other powers in the Americas, and de facto recognition of Danish sovereignty over all of Greenland, which Denmark formally declared in 1921. So the US had bought the Virgin Islands and recognized Denmark's claim to Greenland. At the same time, Teddy Roosevelt's expansion of the Monroe Doctrine and US business interests led to decades of intervention in Central America, often known as the Banana Wars. Central America took on a new strategic importance in the late 19th century. One of the main reasons was the potential for a shipping canal that would link the Atlantic and the Pacific, not only for commerce, but also for warships. The US had shown some interest as early as the 1850s, but the French were the first to actually start building one in 1881. They began digging through the narrow Panama Isthmus, which was under the control of Colombia at the time, but by 1888, the French company went bankrupt with the canal just 40% complete. In 1903, the US struck a deal to buy the assets of the former French company for $40 million. The Colombian government, though, still needed to give its approval since it had conceded the right to dig to the French back in the 1880s. Colombia had just emerged from a bloody civil war and desperately needed money. so some politicians wanted to wait until the original concession ran out in 1904, which would leave Colombia with the French assets. US President Theodore Roosevelt was outraged, as he told his Secretary of State, "I do not think the Bogota lot of jackrabbits should be allowed permanently to bar one of the future highways of civilization." Luckily for Roosevelt, a solution was not long in coming. There were Panamanian separatists who wanted independence from Colombia, and they asked the US for assistance. They received a cryptic response through an intermediary to the effect that US warships could be on the Atlantic coast in 36 hours and on the Pacific in 48. The Panamanian separatists took the hint and announced independence on November 3, 1903. The USS Nashville moved in to prevent Colombian retaliation, which resulted in a near bloodless revolution in Panama. Roosevelt and the Panamanian government then struck an agreement which gave the US a 16-kilometer wide zone to build the canal, with, quote, "all rights, power, and authority as if it were the sovereign of the territory." In exchange, Panama became a US protectorate. One historian described the turn of events as follows. Panama became a rare recorded instance of a country that declared its independence and gave it up at the same time. Building the canal was a triumph of engineering. American engineers chose a challenging system of locks for the canal, which required years of work to complete, but proved more successful than the previous French attempts at a level canal. The project required huge numbers of workers, most of whom were Afro-Caribbean people, especially from Barbados. The work was backbreaking and dangerous, and the attitude of some white American overseers of the black workers was often poor. As more knowledge was gained as to the methods and habits of these Negroes, the engineers became impressed with the belief that a part, at least, of their non-efficiency arose from lack of proper nourishment. In other words, that they were not getting proper food in sufficient and regular amounts to give them strength for continuous work. A major hurdle to construction was tropical diseases, especially malaria and yellow fever. These illnesses had decimated the workforce under the French, so the Americans put experienced sanitation engineer William Gorgas in charge. He had workers drain much of the standing water in the canal zone to lower the mosquito population with success. Even so, about 5,500 workers died during construction. By 1914, the Panama Canal was complete, and Roosevelt's actions ushered in a new era of US involvement in Central America and the Caribbean. In time, the US adopted the so-called dollar diplomacy to influence the region by financial control, and in the early 1900s, big business meant bananas. Bananas started out in the US as a novelty food, but by 1914 they were the second most popular fruit after apples. US companies imported up to 50 million bunches a year, which meant an increase in revenue from $250,000 in 1901 to $13 million in 1910. The fruit was especially popular amongst working-class Americans, because it was cheap and could be easily brought to dirty work sites in its protective peel. Banana excitement even spawned a hit song in 1923 called "Yes, We Have No Bananas." It wasn't long before companies got very interested in the banana business. In 1899, the Standard Steam Navigation Company and the Boston Fruit Company merged to create the United Fruit Company, which soon became a giant multinational. United Fruit was known for its aggressive business tactics, which included undercutting rivals and buying up huge swaths of land in Central America. Eventually, the company owned over 3 million acres in Honduras, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Panama, Colombia, Cuba, and Jamaica. Up to a third of this land was jungle, but owning it prevented rival companies from expanding. On United Fruit's plantations, company laws were gospel. It had its own security forces and spy network, and troublesome workers were unwelcome. Some were even lynched. To keep cash within the company, United Fruit paid its workers in vouchers that could only be used in company stores. So by the early 1900s, United Fruit was expanding so fast it became known as the Octopus. The company now wanted to get into the most lucrative banana-producing country, Honduras. And if you wanted to do business in Honduras, you needed to do business with Sam the Banana Man Zemurray. Zemurray was a banana entrepreneur who was especially known for risky ventures in Honduras. United Fruit bought 60% of his company, but was then forced to sell it back to him to comply with new antitrust laws. Zemurray, though, was unable to afford his shares, and so remained secretly in debt to United Fruit. In 1907, political events put United Fruit's lucrative operations in Honduras at risk. General Manuel Bonilla, dictator and friend of United Fruit, was overthrown by both the Honduran and Nicaraguan armies. In 1910, United Fruit offered to build railways in Honduras in exchange for land and concessions, but the new president, Miguel Davila, refused. The exiled Bonilla and Sam Zemurray had other ideas, though. They hired a group of American mercenaries, including Lee Christmas and his partner Guy Machine Gun Maloney, and bought an old US Navy vessel, the Hornet. The conspirators landed at Trujillo, joined with local supporters and fighters from Guatemala who were most likely hired by United Fruit. The coup was a success, and Bonilla was quickly reinstated despite US attempts at mediation. The US had done little to stop the coup, and American warships had watched as Bonilla arrived. Privately, President William Howard Taft was irritated, since the US was attempting to bring Honduras under its economic control through dollar diplomacy. But he didn't want to get into a fight with United Fruit either. The company denied all involvement, but did benefit greatly from Zemurray's coup. Zemurray received land and tax breaks from Bonilla, which he then passed on to United Fruit to cover his debt. Free of the octopus, Zemurray would eventually become their biggest rival before taking over as president of United Fruit himself. According to journalist Peter Chapman, the Honduran episode would mark a turning point for United Fruit. The events of 1911 in Honduras brought to an end what might be termed the United Fruit Company's nice guy period. There would be little more of that. United Fruit had established its power and was of every mind to wield it. So United Fruit had established itself as a power in Central America, but it wasn't the only one. The US government also didn't hesitate to get involved. Nicaragua was one of the countries of interest to the US, since for some time it was considered a potential location for a transoceanic canal. American business interests, however, also loomed large, especially around the coastal town of Bluefields. In 1909, conservative rebels, including many Americans, overthrew President José Santos Zelaya. Zelaya had been accused of hostility towards US business interests, and he was forced to resign when US Marines landed to protect American citizens. He was replaced by Juan José Estrada, who in turn was replaced by Adolfo Diaz in 1911. Diaz was a big supporter of the US and had business interests in Bluefields. But the closer he got to the US, the more enemies he made in Nicaragua. Minister of War General Luis Mena, with the support of the army, soon called for Diaz's resignation. The US intervened diplomatically to protect Diaz, so Mena cut off electricity in the capital, and his troops bombarded the city for 4 hours. Now that violence had broken out in Nicaragua, the US once again sent in the Marines under Major Smedley Butler, whose troops arrived in August 1912. Butler's orders were not to go after the rebels, but to secure the main railway line and keep any fighting away from it. In September, Butler commandeered a train and headed down the line towards Granada. The rebels had sabotaged the lines with liquid from milkweed, which caused the train's wheels to slip so much the Marines had to get out and push. Once the Americans finally arrived at Masaya, a rebel force of 150 horsemen then ambushed them. Butler ordered the train to drive straight through the attack. It was a gorgeous spectacle. A sheet of fire was spitting into the darkness on both sides of the road. 400 Marine rifles were popping with tongues of flame. The 16 machine guns were rattling out a staccato beat. The engines were screaming and puffing, all in one little narrow street. Mena said the attack was a mistake, but politically the damage had been done. Butler ordered Mena to resign, which he did, though some of his commanders decided to hold out. General Benjamin Zeledon, whose troops had originally attacked Butler, moved his 800 men into defensive positions on 2 fortified hills overlooking Masaya and dug in. On October 4th, around 1,000 Marines and sailors and 4,000 Diaz supporters surrounded the hills. During the night, Marines crept up to the first hill and stormed it. Then they turned the captured artillery against the second hill. Within half an hour, the battle was over, with around 30 rebels and 4 Marines killed. By October 6th, the Nicaraguan rebels had been defeated. Diaz's presidency was secure, and his government erected a memorial to the US forces. We desire that our elder sister, the great Republic of the United States, so wise, so powerful, will bring to us permanently the benefits which all her sons enjoy throughout all her vast and peaceful domain. The opposition Nicaraguan press was less enthusiastic and attacked Butler and his home state personally. They described the US intervention as the blonde pigs of Pennsylvania advancing on our garden of beauty. The US would remain in Nicaragua until 1933 and was often accused of rigging the elections, a claim even Butler did not dispute. The Nicaraguan occupation of 1912 marked a turning point, since it was the first time US forces had actively gone into battle to suppress a revolution. US interventions after Nicaragua were concentrated in the Caribbean, but in 1921, conflict and American troops once again returned to Central America. One of the reasons for the numerous conflicts between Central American states was border disputes. Many ran through poorly mapped jungle, which was a problem when even small pieces of land were hugely important to the small states. A prime example of this kind of conflict was the Coto War between Costa Rica and Panama in 1921. At the center of the conflict was the tiny disputed village of Coto, which was home to 27 families. In 1914, the US confirmed a prior judgment which awarded the village to Costa Rica and ordered the Panamanians to withdraw, even though Panama was a US protectorate. This was politically impossible for Panamanian President Belisario Porras, who was under pressure not to give away any land. In December 1919, Costa Rican President Julio Acosta Garcia called on Panama to finally accept the decision. Although Costa Rica was militarily stronger than Panama, Porras delayed withdrawing in the hopes that the US would protect its protectorate. The Costa Ricans then announced their intention to the US to occupy Coto, but the Americans did not respond. Acosta assumed the US was not interested and sent 28 soldiers to Coto, who quickly overpowered the single police officer. There was an explosion of nationalist sentiment in Panama, which put Porras under even more pressure. Since Panama had no army, volunteers tried to create one, but there weren't enough weapons. Instead, the 1,000 men of the police force were converted into a makeshift Panamanian army. Porras tried to avoid a conflict and publicly said that war between Panama and Costa Rica over valueless land was an absurdity. In response, an angry mob stormed the Senate and Porras was saved by US forces. So a tiny village had brought Panama and Costa Rica to the brink of war. Neither president truly wanted it, but domestic political pressure by nationalists demanded action. And so, in February 1921, the Coto War began. The war started well for Panama despite its military weakness. President Porras heard that the Costa Ricans were going to reinforce their troops in Coto, so he sent General Manuel Quintero with a scratch force of policemen turned soldiers. When they arrived, the Costa Rican garrison withdrew without a fight. Quintero now laid plans to ambush any boats coming across the border by river. On February 27th, his forces ambushed a Costa Rican boat and captured a machine gun, which they used to capture another boat carrying 100 Costa Rican troops. But these were minor victories, and the Panamanians were still desperately short of weapons and ammunition. The next clashes occurred along the Atlantic coast. On March 4th, the Costa Ricans commandeered a United Fruit train and crossed the border on the Sijuola River. The Panamanians did not dare to blow up the bridge, as it was also owned by United Fruit, and so they simply retreated. President Acosta now ordered an advance deeper into Panama. Privately, he actually wanted to provoke US intervention to end a war that he didn't want. 1,200 Costa Ricans, armed with 17 machine guns and 3 cannons, now prepared to land on the island of Bocas del Toro. The US promptly sent warships to the area and forced a stop to the fighting on March 5th. Costa Rica had won the military conflict, but both sides actually benefited from the war politically. Porras made a show of wanting to continue the fight to satisfy the Panamanian nationalists, knowing full well the US would not allow it. The presence of US forces also gave Acosta a convenient excuse to withdraw his army from Panama. In June, Panama sent diplomat Narciso Garay to Washington to plead their case. They were disappointed by the lack of support from their protector and asked for the Coto decision of 1914 to be reconsidered in their favor. The US refused, so Garay wrote a lengthy letter of protest. The acts carried out by the government of Costa Rica under the protection of the United States will be impotent to kill or weaken Panama's right to continue to occupy Panamanian territory. The Cotto judgment only proves that in the present state of the world, force still governs relations between the two countries, and that the rights of the people are only valid in direct proportion to the rifles, machine guns, and cannon they have to back them up. Costa Rica finally occupied Cotto peacefully in September 1921. The Cotto War and the other conflicts in the Banana Wars period had a major impact on the states and people of Central America. US interventions would cause long-lasting political, economic, and social issues. But were the Banana Wars really about bananas? The answer is a bit complicated. United Fruit and other companies certainly played a role, and contemporaries often assumed they had a hand in US interventions. One observer wrote of the Cotto War, "The United States intervened, whether in compliance with her protective treaty obligations towards Panama or to protect the United Fruit Company's extensive plantations near Bocas, it is not possible to say." In fact, the US government and United Fruit were often at odds in Central America. US senators from both parties tried to introduce taxes and antitrust laws to limit United Fruit's growth, while the company's deals with local governments interfered with Washington's dollar diplomacy. Some historians have argued that US financial domination in Central America was not just about money, but about keeping other powers out of the region in accordance with the Monroe Doctrine. According to this argument, many Central American states owed money to European powers, who might intervene in case of political instability or collapse. US hegemony could therefore be preserved via economic control. But for two-time Medal of Honor recipient and Banana Wars veteran Smedley Butler, the wars were about money. Butler became disillusioned with the US role in the region and went on a speaking tour. He later summed up his feelings. "I spent 33 years being a high-class muscleman for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers in 1909-1912. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1916. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the national city bank boys to collect revenue in. I helped in the rape of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street." In 1921, though, these debates were a long way off for Butler and for the people of Central America. Butler and the Marines would return to Nicaragua in 1929 to put down another revolution, and US interventions in the region continued for years to come. And for the United Fruit Company, business was still booming. So by the early 1930s, the US had a legacy of multiple long-term interventions in Central America, sometimes with military occupation, and in other cases as an indirect imperial policy. And as Smedley Butler wrote, US involvement in the Caribbean followed a similar pattern. Some US politicians thought the country should just annex Cuba, but President William McKinley refused. Instead, he created a provisional government under an American military governor that was supposed to introduce social, political, and economic reforms to modernize the island. Congress also passed the Platt Amendment, which allowed the US to intervene in Cuba in the future, and gave the US Navy use of the territory at Guantanamo Bay. But for Governor Leonard Wood, progress was still too slow. Cubans had enjoyed a 3-hour workday under Spanish rule, and Wood claimed that their experience as a Spanish colony made it difficult for Cubans to adopt what he saw as productive American habits. The great mass of public opinion is perfectly inert. Especially this is true among the professional classes. The passive inactivity of 150 years has settled over them, and it is hard to get them out of old ruts and old grooves. We're much hampered by the lack of practical experience on the part of the really influential men, and much tact has to be used to steer and divert them without offending or causing pain. However, by 1902, the Americans decided that conditions were stable enough for US troops to withdraw and leave Cuba in local hands. But just 4 years later, in 1906, Cuba's two main political parties, the moderates and the liberals, were clashing in pre-election violence. Cuban president and moderate leader Tomás Estrada Palma was accused of using security forces to ensure his re-election. The liberals, who were no friends of American involvement in the country in general, now called for the US to ensure free elections. President Theodore Roosevelt chose not to intervene, and the situation in Cuba degenerated. The liberals began to raise an army, and by September they had 24,000 men under arms. They controlled the railways and were now threatening the capital. The moderate government only had about 3,000 police, so this time the moderate party called on the US to come to Cuba. Roosevelt still didn't send troops and instead called on President Estrada Palma to resign, which he refused to do while the liberals were still armed. Meanwhile, the liberals rejected the idea of disarming unless they had US protection. So in September, 2,000 Marines were once again sent to the island with instructions to accept the Cuban president's resignation and again form a new provisional government. Fresh elections were held in 1908 and have been described by one historian as, quote, the fairest in Cuban history. The liberal candidate got the most votes, so with order seemingly restored, the US once again withdrew its forces in 1909. But some observers were worried about what might come next. US Administrator and Army officer Robert Bullard made a pessimistic prediction. The US will have to go back. It is only a matter of time. Bullard turned out to be right, and American Marines returned to Cuba in 1912 to stop further violence. So the US had fought a war in Cuba in 1898 and intervened numerous times in the years that followed. But with America's growing influence and the outbreak of the Great War in Europe in 1914, Cuba wasn't the only Caribbean island where the US was getting involved. The completion of the Panama Canal in August 1914 and its importance to US interests presented a new strategic problem in the Caribbean. The Americans already controlled Cuba and Puerto Rico, but the island of Hispaniola presented a potential weak point in US defenses of the eastern approaches to the canal. This sensitive point became even more of a problem for the US when Americans accused Haiti of getting too close to German influence. Haiti covered half of Hispaniola and had won its independence from France back in 1804. The country's leaders had been unreceptive to US diplomatic advances and sometimes dealt with German businessmen who'd married into the local Haitian elite. By 1914, US authorities considered Haiti to be aligned with Germany, and they would not tolerate a foreign power's influence in the region, or the lost opportunities for American companies. They also felt that given the population's African origins, Haitians would not be able to govern themselves. In the view of the Haitian government, they were simply acting as would any sovereign nation. The US began to make plans for an intervention, but events soon overtook them. Haiti had long struggled with political instability, and since 1911, 7 presidents had been assassinated or deposed. From the American point of view, it was this type of chaos that was making it possible for German influence to grow. Inside Haitian society, though, the situation was more complicated. The island was ruled by a privileged French-speaking elite that considered itself apart from the poorer Creole-speaking majority. The violence that often broke out in Haiti usually involved armed groups known as cacos. To some observers, the cacos were revolutionaries for hire, who periodically captured Port-au-Prince for the highest bidder before returning home to their villages. But to others, including many Haitians, they were the expression of the population's desire to resist unscrupulous leaders, and soon enough, foreign occupation. In July 1915, a new round of political violence came to a head. Just a few months earlier, President Villebrun Guillaume Sam had ordered the execution of 167 opponents of his regime. When the sentence was carried out, the population rose up against him under the leadership of Dr. Rosalvo Bobo. Bobo was an intellectual who had supported popular uprisings against previous Haitian rulers and opposed Sam's closer relations with the United States. During the July uprising against Sam's executions, Sam was dragged from the French embassy where he'd been hiding and was killed by an angry crowd. When news of the assassination got out, U.S. Rear Admiral William Caperton was in command of a nearby U.S. Navy cruiser squadron. Without waiting for orders, he landed 5 companies of Marines and sailors and made for Port-au-Prince. Resistance was light, and U.S. troops were soon in control of the city, even though this was in violation of international law. Caperton said that he acted to protect foreign lives and property, and to establish order and maintain Haiti's constitution. President Woodrow Wilson approved the occupation, and in the following months, Caperton appointed Philippe Soudre d'Artigonave as president of Haiti. He also forced through a treaty that made Haiti into a virtual colony of the United States. The treaty gave the U.S. control of Haitian finances, trade, diplomacy, and even gave the U.S. the right to occupy the country for 10 to 20 years. Some of the French-speaking elite in the country was supportive of Caperton, but most of the poorer Creole-speaking population was not, and wanted Dr. Bobo in power and the Americans out. Haitian journalist Élie Guérin wrote of his hopes for the future of the country. The Monroe Doctrine, the Yankee imperialist's mask, no doubt will deteriorate before long. We Haitians must strive with courage to still suffer physically more and more, that is to say, until the end of the European war. In that case, we ought to be patient, calm, and proud, while at the same time enduring suffering, as the hour for our liberation is the coming collapse of the Monroe Doctrine. Relations between U.S. troops and the local population were predictably tense, and were made worse by the racial attitudes of most of the Americans. It didn't take long before the Cacos began a simmering guerrilla war against the occupying forces, under Charlemagne Péralte and Benoît Batraville. In fall 1915, the Marines began to patrol more aggressively outside of the capital, and in a single November raid, killed 50 Haitians in 10 minutes at Fort-Rivière. The Marines had stormed the fort with the help of machine guns, while the rebels had been armed with rifles, sticks, and stones. No U.S. soldiers were killed in the attack. These types of Marine patrols continued, and by January 1916, Admiral Caperton reported optimistically about the military and the financial situation. All Haiti quiet, military control of situation and status quo being maintained. Naval paymasters under Paymaster Conard continue in charge of the customs service and fiscal matters. Practically entire Haitian financial system is now being so administered. And so, with U.S. troops in control of Haiti and a U.S.-friendly president installed, American authorities turned their attention to the Dominican Republic, Haiti's neighbor, and the other state on the island of Hispaniola. After gaining independence from Haiti and then Spain in the mid-19th century, the Dominican Republic had developed into a decentralized state where many of its people identified more with their home region than the new nation. This made the country more susceptible to foreign influence, including from the United States. From 1900 onwards, the U.S. took control of vital Dominican industries, including plantations and mining. This control intensified under President Wilson, who also sought moral leadership over what he considered, quote, uncivilized peoples. Like Haiti, the Dominican Republic suffered from internal turmoil. In 1916, American-friendly President Juan Isidro Jimenez was at the head of a provisional government. But his real power was limited to the capital, and areas outside Santo Domingo were dominated by regional strongmen. In May 1916, the Minister for War, General Desiderio Arias, led a coup against the president. Jimenez fled the country and reluctantly accepted U.S. offers for intervention. The U.S. threatened to bombard Santo Domingo, so Arias fled to his regional stronghold of Cibao. further violence seemed inevitable, so Jimenez resigned, as he explained to the US authorities. "I cannot keep my word with you. I can never consent to attacking my own people." Despite his protests, in June the US sent in the Marines anyway. At Puerto Plata, around 500 Dominican fighters resisted an amphibious assault of 130 Marines. Once ashore, Marine machine guns and supporting naval fire quickly defeated the defenders. Meanwhile, more Marines landed at Montecristi. After taking the town without resistance, they were attacked by local militiamen on the outskirts. According to Marine Commander Captain Frederick Wise, around 150 fighters charged down the hills directly at his machine guns. He concluded they had never seen such weapons before. They dropped all up and down the line. I could see sheer amazement on their faces. Wise's men then advanced along the Yaque del Norte River, with instructions to meet the Marines who'd landed at Puerto Plata outside Arias's capital of Santiago. When the Marines arrived, Arias had already departed, and most of his forces melted back into the population. The city was taken on July 6th without a fight. So with Arias defeated, US control of the Dominican Republic seemed secure. However, back in Santo Domingo, the US was unable to find a pro-American presidential candidate. Instead, in November 1916, they took full and direct control of the country and installed a US military government under Captain Henry Knapp. Unlike in Haiti, there would be no pretense of an independent government. So by 1916, the US had taken control of Haiti and installed a puppet government, and the US military was running the Dominican Republic. But these were not the end of American interventions in the region, and soon the Marines would be sent to familiar places once again. By mid-1917, the level of political violence in Cuba had decreased, even though there were still some areas where it persisted. American businessmen in Cuba were particularly worried about the safety of their sugar plantations. In previous struggles, these plantations had often been burned or abandoned, and so in August, 1,000 Marines were sent in to protect them. This operation was disguised as a training exercise to avoid trouble with Cubans who opposed American influence in the country. By 1921, major political instability had returned to Cuba, which resulted in yet another US intervention. This time, there were claims of electoral fraud concerning the election of moderate candidate Alfredo Zayas. When new elections were held under Marine Guard in March 1921, Zayas once again won. Now desperate for capital, he called on US banks to fund his government. J.P. Morgan Jr. agreed to the tune of $50 million, but only if Zayas introduced wide and sweeping political and economic reforms, including cutting the government budget in half. Zayas agreed, but anti-American reaction made his position look vulnerable. Instead, once Zayas got a hold of the money, he embarked on an extensive spending program and fired many of his American-supported ministers, and became increasingly resistant to following US orders. Meanwhile, Haiti was still an American satellite state. In 1918, the US-backed government forced through a new constitution that allowed foreigners to own property, which had previously been forbidden. Although voters in a subsequent plebiscite overwhelmingly supported the new constitution, only 5% of the population had actually voted. US authorities in Haiti also had started some infrastructure modernization programs, such as rail and road construction. To do this, they revived a French colonial labor system known as the corvée. On paper, this gave Haitians the choice of providing unpaid labor or paying a special tax. Since the vast majority couldn't afford the tax, they had no choice but to work. And this seemed like a return to slavery in the eyes of many. The policy was scrapped in late 1918, but it left lasting resentment. In 1919, CACO leader Charlemagne Péralte launched a renewed revolt against the Haitian government and their American sponsors. His call to arms revived memories of Haiti's own struggle for self-liberation. Haitians, a day like the 1st of January 1804 will soon rise. For 4 years, the occupation insults us in every way. Every morning brings us a new sadness. No fear, we have arms. Let us drive out that ravenous people whose ravenousness is represented in the person of their President Wilson. Traitor, vagabond, rioter, thief. You will die with your country. Peralt rallied about 5,000 fighters and attacked Port-au-Prince, but he failed to take it. On November 1st, 1919, 2 US Marines disguised themselves as Cacos and snuck into his camp and shot him dead. They took a photo of Peralt stripped naked and tied to a door, which was distributed to send a message to his supporters. But instead, it drew comparisons to the crucifixion of Christ and turned Peralt into a martyr. Overall, the period of the Banana Wars saw the US Marine Corps and the Navy generally taking on a central role in US geopolitics. These so-called small wars would challenge the infrastructure and the abilities of the Marines, as well as create a controversial legacy. On the ground, few forces could rival the training and the firepower of the Marines, but many of the US troops were also unprepared for the nature of the fighting in the tropics. In addition, for a mission-centric organization like the Marines, the lack of clear policy and orders in these Banana Wars proved frustrating. Colonel George C. Thorpe, a veteran of the Dominican occupation, wrote in 1919, "It would seem that it would be a fine thing if the troops in the Dominican Republic and Haiti were told exactly what their mission is. Uncertainty is always unsatisfactory. Men can face a very black future if they but know what it is. But an uncertain future, even with bright possibilities, is annoying and unsettling." These issues were compounded by the inherent racism prevalent in the Marine Corps. The US Navy even prioritized sending commanders from the southern states because they thought that they would be better at dealing with people of African origin. These attitudes meant that the Americans often did not recognize and did not understand the political and social dynamics of different Caribbean populations. Instead, local people were usually lumped together based exclusively on race. American attitudes cost the US politically, but they also cost local people's lives, since a black resident's life was not considered as valuable as a white American's. In the Dominican Republic, Dominicans were beaten and fined for criticizing the military occupation. Charles Merkel, a Marine officer known as the Tiger of Sabo, gained a particular reputation for torture and for burning villages. He was eventually arrested, but committed suicide rather than stand trial. After the United States entered the Great War in 1917, some Marine officers were transferred to Europe. The ones who weren't often grew frustrated at missing out on the war in Europe, since the Caribbean was considered a second-rate posting. One Marine officer wrote to his commander, "If I do a good job of clearing these provinces of insurgents and kill a lot, it ought to demonstrate I'd be a good German killer." These frustrations were sometimes taken out on the locals and the small but influential German population. By 1920, stories of abuse began to emerge despite the press censorship in the Dominican Republic. To an American public back home who saw themselves as rescuers, the accusations caused a scandal. Historian Jeannie Johnson summed up the controversy. "Marines alone cannot be saddled with the blame for bringing racism with them. They did this by virtue of their American heritage. But they must own the belligerent actions they vindicated through this perceptual lens. Actions that fell enough outside the American norm, racist as it was, that it was rejected by the Marines' own domestic public and brought shame and indignation down on their service." So despite being overshadowed by the larger conflicts of the period, the Banana Wars would leave legacies that shaped the region for decades. In the Dominican Republic, the occupation lasted 8 years, while in Haiti, it continued for nearly 20. Economics undoubtedly played a large role in the Banana Wars, and the US frequently sought financial domination. But even though money was important, it was not necessarily the end goal for American policymakers. Financial control instead served to underpin geopolitical goals and was seen as necessary for future democracy. However, the frequent threat and use of American military might to push through unpopular treaties and constitutions also fundamentally damaged the reputation of democracy in the region. To many, the supposedly democratic governments were merely American puppets, and that was a claim that was difficult to refute. In some cases, the US presence did result in limited modernization, especially in Cuba, but this was usually limited to the capital cities. The US did create central security forces such as the Rural Guard in Cuba, the Gendarmerie in Haiti, and the Guardia Nacional in the Dominican Republic. These forces did help to end the cycle of political coups that plagued the countries, but they also allowed power to be increasingly centralized. And centralized power would cast a long shadow on the history of the Caribbean in the decades to come. So American presence in the Caribbean in the first 3 decades of the 20th century cemented its role as hegemon in the region. And although the US never fully controlled or occupied Mexico, the US did intervene in its southern neighbor's long revolution and civil war as well. US policy in Mexico during the revolution had been inconsistent, and the Americans had supported various factions at different times, and even sold weapons to Pancho Villa. Now that Villa had been defeated, Wilson wanted stability, trade, and access to Mexican oil fields, so he recognized Carranza's government. Villa was outraged. When he heard of the US decision, he stated, "I emphatically declare that there is much I have to thank Mr. Wilson for, because he relieves me from the obligation of giving guarantees to foreigners, and especially to those who had at one time been free citizens and are today vassals of an evangelical professor of philosophy. I take no responsibility for future events." Some observers have argued that after his defeat at Aguascalientes, Villa began to behave more recklessly, and his men certainly did so in January 1916. Villistas stopped a train carrying 17 American engineers in Chihuahua and executed them. Villa denied he'd given the order for the killings, but this is debated. In February, Villa led 140 fighters on a 2-week expedition across the US border, arriving at Columbus, New Mexico on March 8th. His forces attacked, but accidentally shot into a horse stable they'd mistaken for a barracks, and killed many of the horses that they'd planned to steal. Nearly 300 men of the US cavalry were based in the town and returned fire, but Villa's men managed to raid the town center before they were beaten back. This was the first invasion of US soil since 1812, and left 17 Americans and up to 100 Villistas dead. Now there's a lively debate about why Villa launched the raid on Columbus. Some have said it was to avenge Wilson's recognition of Carranza, others that it was a vendetta against an arms dealer who lived in the town, and still others theorize that Villa wanted to trigger a Mexican-American war in which Mexicans would unite around his anti-imperialist leadership. Whatever Villa's reasons, the raid put pressure on Wilson to retaliate, but he didn't want to risk full-scale war with Mexico. So Wilson ordered a cross-border punitive expedition led by General Jack Pershing and supported by the 1st Aero Squadron. The goal of the 10,000-man expedition was to capture Villa dead or alive, and at first it even had clandestine logistical help from Carranza. Turns out the expedition was poorly planned and supplied, did not know the terrain, and did not get the support of the local population. They did defeat and wound Villa at Guerrero on March 29th, but he managed to escape. Pershing's force marched more than 500 kilometers into Mexico, but could not corner the elusive peasant fighters, like the ones at a skirmish near Tomochic. A heavy fusillade was received from the circular hills to the east. This was the main body of the bandits. The bandits were not concentrated in any particular place, but were scattered along the crest and side of the mountains. They had a decided advantage in position, and there was no possible way of getting around them in the short time left before dark. Immediately the heavy firing began, and the troops encountered considerable fire from the hills to the east, but found only individual bandits or very small detachments to fire upon. As time passed, Villa's reputation amongst the peasants grew even more. Many US troops grew bored and frustrated in their camps and turned to gambling or local prostitutes, both of which were tolerated by the army. And the longer the Americans were in Mexico, the more tensions there were between them and Carranza. By June, he ordered Pershing to leave the country, and small-scale skirmishes broke out between US troops and Mexican constitutionalist forces. Eventually, the American expedition returned home in January 1917 without achieving its goal. Wilson's desire to end the expedition received a boost from the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany had proposed an alliance with Mexico against the US. The Germans hoped that if Mexico attacked the US, the Americans would be less able to supply Germany's enemies in the Great War, France and Britain, with arms and supplies, as they had been doing since 1914. This was the culmination of years of German involvement in Mexico. Back in 1915, German agents had proposed to support ex-President Huerta with weapons and cash if he declared war on the US in the case that he returned to power, a plot the US was aware of. In the end, Mexico remained neutral in the Great War. After the First World War ended, the United States had the possibility of further extending its international presence to Europe and the Middle East. US forces temporarily participated in the occupation of the Rhineland after the armistice and provided humanitarian aid in Europe and the Middle East. But Washington refused to act as a mandatory power to protect and administer a proposed independent Armenia. The 1920s saw US disengagement from Europe, but its policy in the Caribbean and Latin America only changed in 1934. President Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy reduced US interventions in the region, and most direct occupation forces went home. By then, more than 3 decades of imperial expansion and intervention left the United States with an imperial reach from East Asia to the Caribbean, and a legacy of tension and conflict with Latin America. Despite the new commitment, the decades to come would see familiar and new forms of American intervention among its neighbors. We want to thank Sophie Soulière for her help with this episode. As usual, you can find all the sources for this video in the description below. If you're watching this video on Nebula or Patreon, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that thinks that if you offer to buy something from the owner multiple times and they refuse, it's not for sale and you shouldn't steal it.